in a Valley Forge Audubon Society. I first want to welcome everybody here to the presentation. And a couple of things I mentioned earlier is first, we ask that those who have just come on, that you turn off your video and also that you mute yourself. And the way we will go through with the presentation, our presenter will do their presentation. And then if you notice at the bottom, there'll be a little chat there. And in the category of the chat, if you have any questions along the way, please feel free to ask those questions. And then at the end of the presentation, I will relay those to the presenter. So again, I want to thank everybody for coming out today. And what I'd like to do is to welcome our presentation today is Native Plants and Insect Relationships, and it's with Samantha Nestory. Samantha, thank you so much for coming. I am so excited to hear your presentation. I'm very excited about this topic. By way of introduction, Samantha received her Bachelor of Science in Ecology and a Master's of Science in Entomology from the University of Delaware. During her time as a research technician there, she assisted in several labs, including that of Dr. Doug Tallamy, who we're all familiar with because he did a presentation for us, which was wonderful. And Doug's book, Bringing Nature Home, which is just a fantastic book. I highly recommend it. She is passionate about insects and native plants and the native plants that support them. And Sam currently works as a horticulturist at the Stoneley, a public and natural garden preserve by Natural Lands. And she assists in the design, installation, and maintenance of both the garden landscapes and the natural areas. And again, I'm very excited about this presentation. I just want to reiterate again, first of all, please, if you're just dropping in, you want to mute yourself as well as turn off your video. And we are recording this. So if by any chance you know of anybody who missed it and was dying to hear the presentation, make sure you mention that, and you can go tell them to go onto our website and they can take a look at this presentation again.
Hey, Vincent, could I
Yes.
just say one thing? There is a lot of people trying to get on who can't get, the link is not working. Is it possible to put the meetup number and the password in the chat so we could help them get in?
Let me see. Pat, is that an option? Let me see if she's there. We'll see. We'll see if we can do that at some point.
Vince, there shouldn't be a password. I'm not sure why.
Yeah, you should be able to just be able to
try again.
Yeah, tell them to try to turn on the link and see if that allows them to get in. Oh, and I think somebody just posted it.
Patty just posted it.
Yeah, so in the chat there, somebody just posted it. So if anybody's having a trouble, you can just drop it on that point. Okay. And again, the other point is that after the presentation, we'll answer the questions from the chat. We'll ask the questions from the chat. And with that, I'd like to turn it over to Samantha. Thanks so much for coming and talking to us. And I'm really looking forward to this.
Well, thank you so much for the introduction. I'm so looking forward to speaking with all of you about my favorite thing. Well, two of my favorite things, plants and insects. It doesn't get any better. So if you give me 1 second, I'm going to share my screen here. All right. I think that looks good. Is that right, Vince?
That looks good.
Okie dokie. Then here we go. As Vince said, my name is Sam Nestory. I am currently a horticulturist at Stoneley, a natural garden. If we were in person, this is the point at which I would say, who here has been to Stoneley? But I'm going to assume that all of you are going to raise your hands. And if not, hopefully we can remedy that situation very, very soon. We are a public garden in Villanova, Pennsylvania. We are free of charge. We are part of Natural Lands, which hopefully some of you are familiar with, land conservation organization with a network of preserves, but Stoneley is Natural Lands' first, and at this point only, public garden. And just as a quick intro to Stoneley, we are very new in the world of public gardens. We opened in May of 2018, so this past May, we celebrated our 3-year anniversary. And we were the former home of John and Para Haas. We used to be the Haas estate. And from 2018 to now, we have done a lot of changes in the gardens, adding tons and tons of different types of native plants. We really focus on biodiversity. And we focus on biodiversity for the purpose not only of displaying lots of unique, interesting, but also some of our common native plants in beautiful and interesting ways, but also for the purpose of supporting native wildlife, especially insects. So I today am going to share with you just a very, very small snapshot of the many, many interesting and essential relationships between native plants and native insects. So here we go, starting with herbivores. So many of you might be looking at this photo and you might be questioning my choice of photo because butterflies don't typically fall under the traditional definition of herbivore. But as we're all aware, before butterflies flit and fly and sip nectar and pollinate, they come from caterpillars. And caterpillars, if you have heard anything from Doug Tallamy, you know that caterpillars are some of our most important herbivores. So there are so many different types of caterpillars, and I'm just going to point out just a few of my favorites. So this very strange looking thing here on the left is the caterpillar of the red spotted purple. And it looks this strange on purpose because it is mimicking bird poop. This is a strategy used by quite a few species of caterpillars, but for me, it just never gets old. But it does make me look a little bit strange when I'm out hiking and every kind of piece of bird poop that I see, I'm looking extra hard just to make sure, is that a caterpillar? No, it's bird poop. But it's a really, really interesting strategy that multiple different caterpillars use. The adult butterflies, the red spotted purple that you see up here in the upper right, they are generalists. They feed on lots of different kinds of flowers. And the caterpillar of the red spotted purple is considered a generalist as well. They feed on a variety of trees and shrubs, native cherries, oaks, poplars, hawthorns, birches, willows, shadbush, also known as amelanchiers. And so when we think about supporting this type of caterpillar, natives, of course, are the best way that we can support caterpillars, but really you got your pickings when you think about ways that you can support the red spotted purple. One of my favorites is the black cherry, Prunus serratina. It is a fantastic host plant for lots and lots of different species. And I think it's beautiful, but right plant, right place for this one for sure. Another very strange looking caterpillar is this eastern tiger swallowtail caterpillar. Looks kind of like an alien mixed with a snake. It's very weird, but they turn into eastern tiger swallowtails, which are one of our most common butterflies. And it's probably because we've had a recent change in our local forest composition. And by recent, I mean, in the past 100 years. And currently, our composition is starting to favor or is favoring tulip trees. And tulip trees is one of their host plants. Eastern tiger swallowtails are generalists, but they're a little bit pickier than the red spotted purples that we were talking about before in terms of host plants. They feed primarily on wild cherries, magnolias, tulip trees. By the way, magnolias and tulip trees are related. They're both in Magnoliaceae. And then also birches and ashes. So sweet bay magnolia, one of the best plants that we can add into the landscape just for its beauty, for its flower, which smells so good and also gets visited by lots and lots of pollinators. It's semi-evergreen, it's tolerant of our conditions, just really beautiful, but also supports the eastern tiger swallowtail. Again, though, the adults like most butterflies, they'll visit a variety of flowers to collect nectar. Like this particular eastern tiger swallowtail visiting sweet pepper bush, also known as clethra, which is a fantastic addition to any garden. For me, though, the most interesting plant-insect relationships when we're talking about herbivores are the ones that are specialized. So insects, herbivores specifically, can be grouped into kind of two categories. We kind of talked about one, they're generalists, and then we have specialists. Generalists can feed on a wide variety of plants, while specialists can only feed on one group of related plants. And we're all familiar, the poster child of specialist herbivory is, of course, the monarch caterpillar. So monarch caterpillars have evolved over thousands and thousands and thousands of years to eat only milkweed, which is the result of a very, very long and drawn out and continuing evolutionary arms race between the monarch caterpillar and the milkweed, in which the milkweed is constantly developing defenses against the herbivore because it doesn't want to be eaten, while the monarch evolves adaptations to cope with the defenses that the milkweed creates. Sometimes generalists can still feed on plants that host specialists, but in those cases, they usually don't reap the maximum nutritional benefits of the plant, and so it lowers their overall fitness. One benefit of being a specialist is that in lots of cases, if the plant they're feeding on is toxic or deterrent to other animals, they themselves can actually sequester those toxins and make themselves unpalatable to predators. So it kind of forms this little niche partitioning with these species. And I think we're all aware that monarchs do not taste good. They don't taste good in their caterpillar form. They don't taste good in their adult form. So they do not like to, birds do not like to eat them. And that's because they've taken up the toxins from the milkweed. But there's lots of other examples of specialist relationships that we may not be as familiar with. So depending on where you are in southeastern Pennsylvania, there's a chance that you could see one of the very coolest butterflies in the eastern US, and that is the zebra swallowtail. The zebra swallowtail is actually the smallest swallowtail in our region, and we in Pennsylvania are at the northernmost part of its range. So it's not super common up here, but with climate change, we all know that things are shifting northward. So there's a strong possibility that they could move north and become more common in our area. But that does depend on how prolific its host plant is, because this butterfly is a super specialist. The caterpillars feed exclusively on pawpaws. And by feeding exclusively on pawpaws, it makes for less competition. They get higher fitness because they're getting as many of the nutrients as they can from that pawpaw. But it also makes it a little difficult with ranges shifting. So we do have pawpaws in this area, but if you want to support zebra swallowtails, especially as they're moving north, plant pawpaws. Bonus, they're edible. Another bonus, they're deer resistant. Third bonus, they've got these crazy maroon flowers that are actually pollinated by flies and beetles because they smell like rotting meat. Very, very, very cool and strange. We've got another very cool specialist. So we just talked about the smallest swallowtail. And then here we have the largest swallowtail, and not just in our region, but in all of North America. Here again, we have a caterpillar that is mimicking bird poop. This one's doing a better job than the red-spotted purple, doing really, really well there. And these caterpillars feed on plants in the citrus family, which makes them pretty common in the South and the Southeast, where people regularly grow limes and lemons and other types of citrus trees for ornament and for eating in their gardens. But when we think about citrus trees up here, we can't grow oranges, we can't grow limes, we can't grow lemons. So what are we left with? What can we grow in order to support giant swallowtails? Because they are in this area. I've seen one just down the road at Chanticleer. If you haven't been to Chanticleer, it's gorgeous. You should go. But I've seen them there. I know we can get them here at Stoneleigh, and I know that you can get them in your yards too. We just need to provide them with native host plants. And when we talk about things in the citrus family that are native, we really only have two options. The first is hop tree. This is a regional native, Tilia trifoliata. Oh, just one of my most favorite trees, also called wafer ash. It is so delicate, so beautiful. These interesting seed pods hang on for a really long time, just gorgeous. But we've also got a true native, native to Pennsylvania, southeastern Pennsylvania, and that is common prickly ash, Xanthoxylum americanum. Really cool large shrub. It gets these beautiful red berries, but it does live up to its prickly name, so plant with care. Another specialist butterfly is the pipevine swallowtail. I saw a couple of these caterpillars the other day, and they are just so cool. And really interesting story here. So we see the adult pipevine swallowtail here in the lower right-hand corner. And you might notice that we've got a few black and bluish colored dark swallowtails. And it turns out that all of those other swallowtails that are black or dark blue are mimicking the pipevine swallowtail, because pipevine is poisonous. It is toxic. So just like with the monarch, with the caterpillars uptaking those toxins and becoming toxic themselves, same thing happens with the pipevine swallowtail. So the adult pipevine swallowtails and the caterpillars don't taste good. We've got other caterpillars not eating toxic things, but the adults think, I want to pretend to be toxic in something called mimicry. They develop and evolve to look like that other butterfly so that they can signal to predators, oh, I also don't taste good, but it's all a lie. It's all a trick, but a very, very good trick. So if you want to support pipevine swallowtails, we've got a couple of different pipevines that you can plant. We've got Dutchman's pipe, this really, really cool, weird vine that has this interesting flower. And you can also plant woolly Dutchman's pipe, which is Aristolochia tomentosa. Again, this is one you'll want to plant with care. Pipevines, when they're happy, can get very excited. So find the right fence, find the right tree, find the right arbor, and watch pipevine attract these really cool caterpillars. So we're talking about all these specialist caterpillars, and they're fascinating, and they turn into these beautiful butterflies, but not all specialist caterpillars turn into butterflies. Many turn into moths. In fact, we've got many more moth species than we do butterfly species, especially in this area. So here we've got the rose hook-tip moth, and on the right is its caterpillar. If you can see it, you got to look real close, because this caterpillar is a dead leaf mimic. So it is mimicking a curled, dried up leaf of a viburnum, because these caterpillars only eat viburnums. So all of you are birders. I think you might be familiar with how awesome viburnum berries are for birds. Now you just got another reason to plant them so that you can support these awesome rose hook tip moths and caterpillars. There's so many different species of viburnums: arrowwood viburnum, smooth witherrod, black haw viburnum, and supporting all of these, planting all of these viburnums will do more than just provide a host plant. It provides flowers for pollinators. Again, it provides birds with berries. But if you want to support this caterpillar, there's one other thing that you need to do. Rose hook tip pupa, or cocoons, are created in leaf litter. So in order to support them through their entire life cycle, you need to leave your leaves. And that's, I'm sure, something that you've heard of, but doing as little with your leaves as possible in your garden is one of the great ways to support insects in all of their different life stages. Okay, so I could go on and on and on and on about very, very cool caterpillars. And I have a book recommendation at the end of the presentation, so you can get hooked on caterpillars too. But I'm going to move on from caterpillars and talk about a couple of different types of herbivores. We also have specialist beetle herbivores. So all of the beetles that you see here feed on one small group of plants as larvae and as adults. So the sumac leaf beetle is aptly named. They feed on sumacs. The dogbane beetle, again, aptly named. They feed on dogbane. Mottled tortoise beetle, not so helpfully named, but very, very beautiful. And they feed on things in the morning glory family. The larvae of the sumac leaf beetle and of the mottled tortoise beetle, really interesting. They actually cast their skins when they're molting into different larval forms, larval stages. They actually take those skins that they cast off when they get bigger and they attach them to their bodies as well as their fecal material. They attach that to their bodies too, and they essentially create this shield of debris that acts to deter predators. Very weird, very wild. There's some very strange pictures, but I figured we're all just digesting our dinners. Let's not show that. The larvae of dogbane beetles, they're obligate root feeders. So that means that they feed underground on the roots of dogbane. So they don't really need that kind of protection from predators, but their eggs, which are laid on the plant, are covered in frass, which is a fancy term for insect poop. But when we talk about herbivores, not everything eats leaves like caterpillars and those beetles that we talked about. Some insects, in a very interesting adaptation, feed in between plant layers. So here on the left, if you see that kind of wiggly line going down that bark, that is a black cherry bark miner. It is a tiny, tiny microscopic moth larva. And they start in the leaves, they move down the petioles, which are the connectors between the leaves and the stems. They go into the stems, and then they find their way to the bark, and they essentially burrow, tunnel underneath the bark. So that is not broken. None of that bark is broken. They're mining in between the layers, the outer layer of the bark and the inner layer of the bark. Really, really interesting. In the upper right here, we have the native holly leaf miner, often considered a pest of hollies, but really they do nothing other than aesthetic damage. And then we've got down below the columbine leaf miner, which is a really, really tiny black fly larva. So we've got moth larvae and we've got fly larvae mining in between the layers of plant material. And what's super interesting about the insect world is that each of these species of miners probably also has a specialist parasitic wasp that finds its way, lays its egg on the larvae and parasitizes them. The insect world is filled with all of these different and interesting hyper-specialized relationships. So when we talk about herbivores, we're kind of moving into, is that really an herbivore or what's going on here? Because some insects use a plant's own defenses for their own purposes, and they force the creation of these perfect little homes for their young. And these things are called galls. There's so many different types of galls. I could probably do an entire presentation just about galls. They're so interesting. But what you need to know is that an insect comes along and it can be a variety of different insects. So here we've got a fly, we've got a wasp, and we've got an aphid. Those are usually the three top creators of galls in plants. So the adult comes along They lay their eggs usually in a really specific part of the plant. For example, goldenrod gallflies only form in stems. Oak apple gall only forms on leaves, but they usually form on the undersides of leaves. Whereas when we talk about the witch hazel gall aphid, usually only on the top of the leaves. So lots of really cool specialization here. But the adult comes along, they lay their eggs on a specific part of the plant. The eggs hatch, the larvae go inside of the plant, and they cause this reaction in the plant. The plant thinks something's trying to eat me. Why don't I essentially cut it off from the rest of me and kind of isolate it within this little round, sometimes pointy formation. So they've isolated it from the rest of the plant. The rest of the plant can go about its business. But now you've got these larvae inside, and they eat the inside of the gall, and when they're ready, they poke a hole and they emerge. So the plant is not harmed, other than some very, very weird shapes, but the larvae become adults and they exit, and they complete their entire life cycle within that plant. And some herbivores use plant material to create their own homes. So they're not making the plant create a home for them. They're using the plant to make it themselves. So some of you might be familiar with these. They're like these foamy little globs, usually at nodes of plants, and they're caused by spittlebugs. Spittlebugs feed on a variety of plants. They're usually generalists, but the nymphs, when they find a good host plant, they surround themselves with this white bubbly mass. So they essentially force air into the sap that they're excreting as they feed on it. And the air comes from this chamber beneath their abdomen, and then the sap is mixed with this waxy substance. And so instead of popping immediately, the air plus the wax plus the sap provides this protection of bubbles that last for hours and sometimes even days. And so each of these masses can house one, sometimes more nymphs, and the spittle protects the nymphs from predators, keeps them moist until they're ready to emerge as adults, and that's when they get their extreme hopping and flying abilities. All right, so those were some highlights of herbivores, but let's talk about pollinators. Arguably the most charismatic and beloved group of insects, but we're going to talk about some pollinators that you might not be super familiar with. So first up is bees. Everybody loves bees, right? But I like to say that the European honeybee has the best PR team on the block, because despite the fact that it is not native, it has somehow made its way into our vernacular for Save the Bees. We do not need to save the European honeybee. What we do need to save are our native bees, because our native bees are experiencing intense population declines. So you're all probably familiar with our fuzziest group of native bees, and those are our bumblebees. There are 17 species of bumblebees native to Pennsylvania, and most of them are experiencing population declines. Bumblebees are really interesting. They're kind of so they have an annual life cycle as opposed to a perennial life cycle like a honeybee, but they still have a queen, they still have workers, and they still have a nest. And they create, the queen emerges in the spring and she creates this nest underground. And once she's created enough workers, they do the rest of the work. She continues creating new workers for the nest. And then at the end of the season, the new mated queen leaves the nest. She goes to hibernate under some leaves, and the rest of the nest dies for the year. Bumblebees are generalist foragers. That means that they can feed on just about anything that they can access, and they can get nutrition from it. But one thing that they can do that most other pollinators can't is buzz pollination. So they hold on to a flower and they can vibrate their bodies and essentially manually knock the pollen from the flowers And therefore, they can be really, really effective pollinators, usually more effective than honeybees. In fact, a lot of our native bees are more effective pollinators than honeybees. One of my favorite groups of bees are the leafcutter bees in the family Megachilidae. And the reason is twofold. First of all, you can tell leafcutter bees from other bees by where they hold their pollen. So most bees carry their pollen in corbicula or on scopi, which are just essentially hollowed out parts of their legs. So also called pollen pants. So I'm sure you've seen bees flying around and they've got big masses of pollen on their back legs. Leafcutter bees, on the other hand, have a scopa on their belly. And so they hold the pollen on their belly, which I think is just so, so cute. They are generalist foragers, like our bumblebees, but they get their name from these almost perfect little circles that they cut out of many, many different types of plants that they use to create their nest. Unlike bumblebees, unlike honeybees, leafcutter bees are solitary. So each female is creating her own nest. They're not working together to raise young. So she cuts these perfect little circles and lines a cavity with those circles to create an extra safe environment for her eggs and for her larvae. Very, very cute, very adorable. I've seen these kind of perfect circles, especially on redbuds. You might notice kind of late in spring, early in summer, those perfect circles cut out of redbud leaves. Mining bees are in a group of native bees that usually tends to go unnoticed. These bees are some of the very first to emerge in the spring, and they are essential to the successful pollination of some of our very favorite native plants. Think trilliums, think Jacob's ladder, think spring beauty, think geraniums. Think of all of those spring ephemerals or spring flowering plants. Mining bees are doing the bulk of that pollinating. These bees are solitary, they're ground nesters. You can see why they're called mining bees. Each female creates this mine underneath the ground, which is where she lays her eggs. And they collect pollen. So not only do the adults collect nectar, and they themselves might eat pollen, but the pollen that they're collecting is usually for their larvae. Pollen is really high in protein. It's a great nutrient source. So they create these balls of protein packs. They bring them to their nest. They shove them down there. And you can see the different structures of each of these nests. Some are really simple. It's just one tunnel going down. Some are bifurcated. Some look like weird alien octopi. Some are really big. Some are much smaller. All of these can be found within one species, depending on the female, or they can be unique to different species of mining bees. But one thing that we need to think about with not just mining bees, but all of our native bees. So we have over 4,000 species of native bees in the US. In the Eastern US, we've got over 750 native bee species. Of those 750 native bee species, 25% are pollen specialists. That means that their larvae can only successfully develop on the pollen of a small group of related plants. So you can't just plant anything and hope that it helps our native bees. There's lots of, again, pollen specialists that we need to consider when we're planting for native bees. But what do we plant? And what do they support? Well, solidago, goldenrod. Goldenrods are some of the best plants that you can plant, not just for native bees, but for so many of our insects. Goldenrods have really high quality pollen, really high quality nectar. They not only help our native bees, but they also help monarchs. They're not milkweed, they're not supporting the caterpillars, but they've got the nutritious nectar that they need to make their way down to Mexico. And some people get scared when we talk about goldenrod in the garden because there are some goldenrods that get a little excited and may not be the best in the garden, but I can tell you that these 3 species are great in the garden. They can absolutely take care of themselves, but also won't get too happy. And in fact, Solidago flexicalis, also called zigzag goldenrod, it's a shade tolerant, shade tolerant goldenrod, so it can handle some shade. But goldenrods are supporting so many different types of bees, including these 3 that you see here. The one on the left is really common, but the one on the right is really rare. So we need to plant more goldenrods so that we can bolster those populations. Asters, another great thing that you can plant. You can plant aromatic aster, you can plant blue wood aster, you can plant heath aster. They come in all sorts of different colors. But when you're planting asters, you're supporting, again, you're not just supporting these specialist bees, but you're also supporting monarchs. You're also supporting butterflies. You're also supporting wasps, which are important in our native ecosystems. Plus, they're gorgeous. You can't go wrong with asters. You really can't. What else can you plant to help our native bees that are pollen specialists? You can plant sunflowers. Helianthus decapetalis can handle some shade. Helianthus divaricatus, also called woodland sunflower, can handle some shade. But then if you've got sun, go for it with some giant sunflower. Helianthus giganteus, gorgeous, flowering right now, looking really beautiful, adding a lot of color to the garden, and again, supporting pollen specialist bees. You can also plant some tried and true garden favorites, black-eyed Susan, brown-eyed Susan, cutleaf coneflower, lots of things, again, supporting those native pollen specialists. Vacciniums, this includes deerberry, but most importantly and most common, blueberry. So when you plant blueberries, you're supporting pollen specialists. And you can see some of these photos right here. If they're pollen specialists on vacciniums or blueberries, which have these small little bell-shaped flowers, it usually means that the bees themselves are very small. And so it's just very, very cute. And one last group I'll highlight, something that tends to get overlooked are our native willows, not the weeping willows that are very common, but our native willows. We have a lot of willow specialists. So planting Salix discolor or pussy willow, planting Salix sericea, silky willow, planting Salix humilis, which is prairie willow. Planting these in your garden is going to support native bees. And if you can't plant it in your garden, ask someone else to plant it. Try and get your county, try and get your township to plant it. So there's this really cool website that you can go to and look at just all of the pollen specialist bees of Eastern United States. This is put together by Jared Fowler and Sam Droege. If you're familiar with bees at all, Sam Droege, that name might hit a nerve or might be recognizable. He is the bee king, the king of bees. But bees are not the only pollinators that we want to consider. And Vince, this is for you. You were asking about that, that insect on that first slide. This is what it is. It is a hoverfly. Hoverflies are really common pollinators. Right now, I'm seeing them everywhere. They range from fairly small to very small, but they are all very adorable. They love open flowers, accessible flowers, and most of them are bee or wasp mimics. They're trying to look like things that they are not. They cannot sting, they cannot bite, they can't hurt you at all, but they are helping you by pollinating. But they're not just helping you by pollinating, in fact. So on the left, we've got the very adorable adult hoverfly. And on the right, we have its weird translucent alien larva. And the larvae go up and down stems and they eat aphids. So if you have aphids in your garden, one thing that I really like to tell people is let's change our perspective on what classifies as a pest. right? So of course we've got invasive pest insects. They require action. They require us to be diligent. Spotted lanternfly, emerald ash borer, those are significant pests. But when we talk about other pest insects like aphids, let's view them in a different light. Let's not look at them as pests that are eating our plants. Let's look at them as insects that are eating our plants that are actually providing food for some very, very cool insects. Lots of things love aphids because they're essentially candy. They're just packed full of sugar. Really delicious, I imagine. I haven't tasted an aphid, just in case you thought I was that weird. I promise I'm not quite there yet. But these hoverfly larvae go up and down stems and they eat aphids, and they can take care of an infestation in a matter of days. It's amazing. And then they turn into pollinators. So we've really got a twofer here when we talk about beneficial insects in the garden. But did you know that even beetles can be pollinators? Beetles are among the most diverse group of organisms on the planet. And I mean that. Beetles make up 22% of all described species. That includes plants. There are more species of beetles than there are plants in the world. How crazy is that? That's so cool. If you couldn't tell, beetles are my favorite group of insects. I'm getting a little carried away here. But when we think about that, it really is no surprise that there are pollinators among their ranks, right? They cover all sorts of different ecological niches, and they fill all sorts of functions in our ecosystems. So if we look down at this rust and yellow colored beetle in the bottom right, this is a banded flowerhorn beetle. I've got another twofer here for you, because as larvae, they feed on decaying hardwood. So as larvae, they are recyclers. But as adults, they visit flowers. So they collect pollen, they pollinate, they do a great job. This one's on elderberry, which is, again, a fantastic plant for multiple reasons. Some of you may recognize this orange and black beetle here. We're just coming into the season for this. This is a goldenrod beetle, or a Pennsylvania leatherwing, and it's a type of soldier beetle. Another twofer, their larvae are predators. They eat lots of different insects in the soil. They eat pests like cucumber beetles, and then their adults flying around, pollinating, usually found on yellow flowering things like sunflowers, rudbeckia, which are cone flowers, and namesake goldenrod as well. And then in the upper right, we've got an insect with one of the cutest names. It's called a tumbling flower beetle. And these guys get their name because when they're disturbed, they curl up into like a little C form and they fall off the plant. They're pretty small, but they also pollinate, and they do a good job. All right, the last kind of group that I'm going to focus on here are our recyclers. When we talk about recyclers, specifically regarding recycling coarse woody debris, and that's actually a scientific term, so people use it in papers and everything, coarse woody debris, CWD, but that just means logs and other large tree debris. So logs, large branches, fallen trees, that's all coarse woody debris. When we talk about recyclers, the specialized relationships with plants, it doesn't depend so much on the species or the group of trees. More so, it depends on the stage of decay. So recyclers can be specific on stages of decay of coarse woody debris. Although if we're getting a little technical, there are insects that help with recycling or do recycle, and often they'll kind of favor either hardwood, like oaks and hickories and beeches, or they will prefer and favor softwood. And so that's pines and firs and spruces and stuff. But other than that, they're specializing on a stage of decay. Termites are one of the few insects that almost everybody in the world is aware of, I would say. But unfortunately, it's not for any good reason. The word termite generally not something especially homeowners want to hear. But before termites ate the wood in your homes, which hopefully they're not doing for anybody, but before they could do that, they had to eat deadwood, right? There were no homes, so they had to eat something else. So they ate deadwood. And in fact, they're arguably one of the most important insects in terms of decomposition and recycling of coarse woody debris. Termites can consume as much as 20% of all the dead wood in our forests. And for such tiny insects, that is a massive, massive, massive feat. And not only do they consume it, but they actually do a good job of digesting it, thanks to symbiotic gut flora, aka bacteria and protists that live inside of their guts and help them break down one of the hardest to digest and break down compounds in the natural world, which is cellulose. So they're actually not only just consuming it, but they are digesting it as well. So the feeding and digesting of the wood, plus the physical tunnels that they make, jumpstart the decomposition process in this coarse woody debris. Along with termites, wood-boring beetles are some of the first to colonize deadwood, and they're really vital in creating habitat for other organisms to come in later in the process and assist with even more recycling. So these beetles bore holes and tunnels into dying or newly dead wood, and they create more surface area and avenues for other organisms to colonize. They also, by the physical movement from the outside to the inside of the tree, they bring all these microorganisms like bacteria and fungal spores into the interior of the wood, and they essentially inoculate the tree with more things that will help recycling. So this group are the jewel or metallic wood boring beetles. And they're just one group of wood boring beetles, but they're arguably some of the most beautiful of all the beetles. So the adults lay their eggs, but the hard work is done by the larvae, and the larvae are the opposite of cute. Not very cute, but you can see this photo in the upper right. That is a picture of a metallic wood-boring beetle larva. They've got giant heads, but that helps them push through the wood, create these tunnels, and feed just under the bark. So, but again, I just want to point out, as with all insect groups, we cannot make blanket statements. We can't say all metallic wood-boring beetles are good and only feed on dead wood, because emerald ash borer is a type of metallic wood-boring beetle, and they do feed on live wood. So they're contributing to the decline of our ash trees. But most of the group, good guys, helping to break down wood in our forests and in our gardens. We've also got another group of wood-boring beetles, Cerambycidae, or our longhorn beetles, named aptly because they've got really long antennae, often that exceed the length of their body. Like metallic wood-boring beetles, longhorn beetle larvae can be specific when it comes to their hosts. So they generally prefer hardwood. Adults lay eggs under the bark, the larvae bore into the wood, they eat as they go. They're often called round-headed borers. You can see they've got this kind of really chunky, almost like drill-shaped head. They're very good at creating, again, tunnels in the wood. And they break down cellulose in a similar way to the termites. So they've got something helping them, but instead of bacteria, instead of fungi, instead of protists, they have enzymes in their digestive tract that helps to break down that wood. So cerambycids and longhorn beetles and metallic beetles are the first step. They can live as larvae for maybe 2 or 3 years before they emerge as adults. So that means that dead wood is taking 2, 3, maybe even more years to get almost to kind of this next stage. And a little later in the decay process, we see one of my favorite beetles, and this is called it goes by many names: best beetles, peg beetles, patent leather beetles. No matter what you call them, they're very cool. They're one of the only beetles that actually displays parental care. So they live in family groups usually in pretty well rotted logs. And the adults will pre-chew wood to feed to their larvae, and they can even talk to each other, or I should say communicate with each other through something called stridulation. That's just a fancy term for rubbing two body parts together to make a noise, but they can communicate with their larvae within the log and essentially communicate either danger or other things. And so you see this group of larvae here. This is actually called a nursery. That's how much parental care they display. So, I talked about ways that we can support these insects. Flowers, that makes sense. Planting host plants, I think that makes sense, especially if you've heard from Doug Tallamy. But when we talk about supporting recyclers, how can we do that? Well, we can leave snags in our yard. So if you have a tree and it dies, and you can safely keep all or part of that tree, do it. If it won't fall on your house, cut it off at a safe height and let it decay and just watch all of the very, very cool things that come. And I don't need to tell you all that this snag here on the left is looking prime for some woodpecker activity. And if you can't leave it standing, leave it lying. If you can't leave the whole thing, leave the stump. If you can't leave the stump, leave some branches. Anything you can do in terms of leaving dead, decaying material in your garden. And there's, interesting, unique, not visually, visually pleasing ways that you can do that. Do it so that you can support all of these cool things, and then watch a woodpecker come in and take care of those larvae and make a meal out of them. All right. So kind of wrapping up here, I know that that was a lot of information, lots of insect talk, lots of plant talk too. I don't think that I need to convince most of you that native plants are one of the best ways that we can support our insects. So instead, I talked about some of that. So instead right now, I just want to encourage you all, take some time, observe the insects in your gardens, on your hikes, on your bird walks, wherever you can. Take a moment, observe the insects around you. The more that we learn, the more that we teach about insects, the more that we can appreciate them. And they're so, so worthy of our appreciation. They are so, so cool. There's so many of them. It's literally endless how much you can learn about insects. So I encourage you, start now. I know I'm going to be working the rest of my life to learn as much as I can. Here are just a couple of my favorite resources. Different goals with each of these. If you're looking for a great lightweight field guide, the Kaufman Field Guide to Insects, nice and colorful. You can find pretty much anything you're looking for in there, well organized. I was talking about how cool caterpillars are. David Wagner's got an awesome field guide to caterpillars. I've used mine so much, it has broken in half officially. It's a little heavier. It's more like, let's take a picture of this caterpillar. Let's go home and figure out what it is. This tracks and signs of insects and other invertebrates. It's if you find something and you're like, I think an insect made that, or I think an insect comes from that. This is really cool for that. And then this book on the right, Insects, Their Natural History and Diversity. This is like it's a pretty big book. I have it, it's awesome, it's colorful, but that's, I would save that for later in the process. Once you've really developed a love for insects, add that to your holiday list. And it's a really, really good one. There's also online resources, bugguide.net, really great. And then there's plenty of really awesome Facebook groups for helping to identify insects and just talking about how cool they are. I hope that you learned a little something today. And with that, I'm happy to answer any questions.
Hi, Sam. Thank you so much. That was a truly wonderful presentation. We really appreciate all the information. I think it's one of these situations we'll have to have you back every year simply because it's that important, the information. And I really appreciate just some of these things I have floating in my yard. I never knew what they were. I didn't know their life cycle. So I really appreciate all the details. So let me see if I can jump in and see questions. Looks like a lot of people just love the presentation. Let's see. Here's one. Just started reading The Butterfly Effect, Insects and the Making of the Modern World, which was recently released. Let's see. Okay. And I'm trying to think if, and I think I accidentally deleted some people's questions early on. So if I missed out on a question, please send it into the chat again if I accidentally deleted it. I had a question, Sam, and it has to do with the last 2 years. I suspect my neighbor's front yard is completely filled with mining bees, which I am ecstatic about. And they're new neighbors and they're very freaked out. And I've tried to, talk a little bit about it and demonstrated just how basic tame they are. However, how do I talk to my neighbor about the value of keeping them? Because I get the feeling that they're not going to want to keep them, and of course, I want to keep them. To give you an idea, in the springtime, there is probably an area of about, I'm going to say, 60 by 60 that is completely filled with bees.
That's amazing. I can only dream of creating that type of habitat for our native mining bees. It's a tough one. Insects have a really, really bad rap, especially bees. When in fact, most of our bees are not going to hurt you unless you shove your hand inside, grab them. Even then, they're probably not going to do anything. One thing I find with mining things, especially right now, you might all have seen the cicada killer wasps. They're real big, chunky wasps. They look really scary. They're not going to hurt you. They're strictly there to try and find the cicadas, bring them back to their nests, lay their eggs on them. Their eggs hatch, the larvae eat, the larvae eat them, but they're creating kind of all of these mines. One thing that I find that helps is saying that they are temporary. So mining bees, they're only active for a few weeks. So if they find, that's one thing that you can say. Also, it's just really difficult to, especially in kind of a short period where you're trying to prevent action from taking place, detrimental action. Maybe pointing them to some of these webinars and things that are becoming so much more available now that we are in this kind of Zoom-averse that we're in. Maybe there is a mining bee specific one. When people see close-ups of their faces, I think they're really cute. I think we can convince other people that they're really cute, in addition to being really helpful.
Yeah.
But just pushing that, if they want to save the bees, this is part of it. Save the bees is it's generally a campaign people can get behind, but when it's in your own yard, sometimes it's a little bit different. But 70% of all of our native bees are ground nesters. So 60 by 60 sounds amazing to me. I would encourage them to observe it. Go outside, observe. The more we're familiar, the less scary they are.
Yeah, and one of the things I did was I demonstrated just how tame they are, where the males are just running around all over the surface. The females are popping their little heads out of the ground. And I'm basically just showing it's like, they don't sting, they don't do anything. But it's really hard to convince people that this is, because I got to be honest with you, this is the first time I've ever seen this in my life. And trying to convince somebody that this is actually a good thing. You have something that's really, really cool as compared to, and rare in this particular area.
Mhm.
But then it kind of begs the question too, because then it feels like, I don't know if I'm part of the fault, because I've gone very, very natural with my yard. And in
Mhm.
particular, I have a heavy, heavy concentration of red buds. And I don't know if they feed on that, but it seems like ever since my red buds really got big, all of a sudden this colony established
And
itself.
I mean, again, that's awesome that something that you're doing is helping.
Mhm.
Bees don't understand, human-made boundaries or political boundaries, unfortunately. If they did, we'd say, hey, no, just over here. But another thing you can point out is that creating habitat for insects and bees like that can be really, really difficult, because it's something about the soil. It's easy enough to dig. So
Yeah.
they've got something really special there, really special. So if they can kind of view it as like, oh, it's our spring bee party, something like that. Isn't that great? And then they go away and you forget about them. And then they come back next spring and it's a bee party again.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah, I was really glad you talked about the hoverflies, because for the life of me, I could not figure out what their life cycle was, and now I know, and I'm going to be looking for the larvae on the plants themselves.
Just look wherever aphids are, you can find lots of cool predators around.
Yeah. Yeah, and I love that you described that the aphid is a sweet treat or something like that. I thought that was really good. Let's see if we have any other questions. I don't want to hog up everything. Oh, here we go. We do have lots of questions. Let's see. There was a question on whether or not the miners in the cherry trees damage the trees. I'm sorry.
So no,
Okay.
they are damaging to that particular, area, but in a big enough tree, it's not affecting nutrient movement, unless it's a heavy infestation. But I've never seen that. Usually miners are pretty singular when they're bark miners, and then otherwise you're looking at the holly miners and the columbine miners, usually coming in after peak photosynthetic period, and hollies put out their new leaves and they can handle it.
Another question here is gypsy moths are bad, bad, bad. And it kind of begged the question is, I heard that there was some big infestations of gypsy moths, but I haven't seen an infestation locally of gypsy moths for a long time. Is there a reason why we haven't had any infestations in this region for a long time?
That's a good question. So gypsy moths favor a few different types of trees as opposed to all the trees. So they tend to favor oaks. Our forests around here don't really have a lot of oaks when we think about it. So possibly there's not enough mature oaks to support an infestation because they took care of that in the 80s. Another thing is with many, many different types of, especially pests, they go through quote unquote boom and bust periods. So that period could be year to year. It could boom one year and bust the next, or it could be multiple years of, boom, or it could be multiple years of bust. So that's something that, I don't know a ton about the boom and bust cycle of gypsy moths, but I do know that one cause of their bust years, one thing that can keep them under control is a native fungus. There's also been some, things that have been released to take care of the gypsy moths as well.
Another question here. How can I keep carpenter bees away from homes?
That's a very good question. I wish I had an easy answer for you. One thing that I've heard might work is taking a paper bag and stuffing it and hanging it near your home. It imitates a wasp nest, and they could be deterred by that. Secondly, right now, you might be seeing really, really big black flies with kind of this gray mottling on their abdomens. Those are tiger bee flies. I encourage everyone to look them up. They can look kind of scary. They kind of look like a horsefly. They're not. Tiger bee flies are parasitic on carpenter bees. So they are one of the things keeping carpenter bees under control. So as adults, they just fly around. Don't swat them, don't kill them. Let them do their thing, and they might take care of a few of your carpenter bees. Other than that, the best possible thing that we can do in terms of creating an ecosystem that naturally regulates itself is promoting diversity. Planting as many different trees, shrubs, perennials as we can, having flowers blooming all the time, providing lots of different host plants. If you can't do it just in your yard, try and talk to your neighbors. It really is becoming a movement. So I don't think that it's impossible for us to do this. Creating a biodiverse backyard is going to create a biodiverse community of wildlife, and therefore things will kind of naturally take care of each other, excluding invasive pests, of course. That's always the eternal asterisk.
Yeah. Here, and that actually follows into our next question. Do lanternflies require allianthus to breed?
So, as far as I know, yes, that is still the case, that they need it at some point in their lives, but we don't know why necessarily, and we don't necessarily know when either. So this recommendation is still remove all tree of heaven, aka Ailanthus altissima, in your yard, in neighboring properties, encouraging neighbors to get rid of it, encouraging your parks to get rid of it. I think everybody in terms of parks and townships and things are on board with this. It's just a matter of resources. So another thing you can do is volunteer. Otherwise, in terms of controlling spotted lanternfly, swat away. I've heard of someone using a vacuum. They said it works very well, but again, just whenever we're talking about a pest, insect, and control, please consider the non-target effects, aka how will it affect the birds? How will it affect the other insects? That's why the sticky bands are a no-go, because they're hurting our birds, they're hurting our katydids, they're hurting our other insects in that way. And you can scrape the egg masses in the winter. If you're looking for something to do in the long winter time, fun.
A job for the kids.
Yes. My brothers are very good now.
Let's see. Here's a question. How do semi-aquatic hemipterans affect pond plants?
Oh, that is a great question. I am not very familiar with aquatic insects. As far as I know, they don't affect plants all that much. A lot of aquatic insects that I'm familiar with are detritivores. That means that they're feeding on the leaves and things that fall off those plants and into the water, or they are predators. So a lot of things use the water just as like a holdover, like when we think about mosquitoes, they're developing there, and then they emerge and they fly away. So lots of predators in water feeding on mosquito larvae and other sorts of larvae. But there are some plant feeders in there. But if you've got, again, a good system going, then nothing's gonna necessarily kill any of your aquatic plants.
Another question. Will goldfish eat the mosquito larvae in a small pond?
That's a good question. Possibly.
Yeah.
So when we talk about ponds, it ultimately depends on what your goal is.
Yeah.
So if you just want a place to display some aquatic plants and you want fish, then you will get insects. That's how it works. They find it if it's there. And a lot of fish do take care of any insects that are in the water.
Yeah.
However, if you want to support amphibians at all, many of them need fishless ponds. So when we think about spring peepers and a lot of our really, really adorable little frogs, they need fishless ponds. So ultimately it depends on what your goal is, but the frogs, the tadpoles will also eat the mosquito larvae, as will dragonflies.
Yeah.
Dragonflies, oh, they're just the best. They'll eat them as larvae, they'll eat them as adults. That's the best.
This is just also a little heads up. Valley Forge Audubon Society will be hosting some native plant walks for the coming fall season. So definitely keep your eyes to our website for those programs. I'll be leading some of those walks. Trying to think if there was any other questions. Let's see.
Looks like some questions about killing Tree of Heaven.
Oh, yes.
Yeah, that's a really tough one. There are lots of trees that you can just cut down. They'll resprout, and then you just continue to cut those suckers off, and that will take care of it. That is not the case with Tree of Heaven. They are vengeful. So you cut the tree and it sprouts everywhere. Unfortunately, the only way that I know that is very effective is doing a paint of herbicide, but 1 or 2 treatments should take care of it. It saves you a lot of effort, and then suddenly that makes some space for you to plant another tree, save your energy for planting native plants as opposed to trying to cut every sucker of Ailanthus. That is one that generally requires some sort of herbicide treatment, but it is very targeted.
Are mason bees native bees?
That's a great question. So we do have native mason bees. The mason bee that is often kind of touted as super pollinator for agriculture is a Western species. The blue mason bee is a Western species, so doing great out there. We don't necessarily want it here. Rocky Mountains are a nice dividing line there, but we do have native mason bees.
Let's see. Another question. What do you think is causing the lack of fireflies this year? What natives should be planted to encourage more of them?
That's a great question. So fireflies cannot necessarily be helped with planting native plants, at least not directly. Fireflies, as adults and as larvae, are predators. So if you've ever seen a firefly larvae, it kind of looks like an alligator. It's got this really narrow face. And the reason it's so narrow is because one of their favorite foods are snails. So their head is really narrow so they can get their face all the way into that curling shell and get every little bit of snail. And then the adults are either predators also, or they don't even eat at all as adults. One important thing for fireflies is that most of them overwinter in leaf litter. So we talked about leaving the leaves for, I'm forgetting now, the rose hook-tip moth. Leaving the leaves also helps fireflies. So that means trees. So if you plant trees and shrubs, let those leaves fall in the fall, leave them where they lie or gently blow them into your beds, but don't rake them and move them out because you're eliminating habitat when you do that. So keep those leaves. Don't use pesticides in your yards. Don't spray for mosquitoes. Don't spray for lanternflies. Despite what those companies say, no pesticide is lanternfly specific. No pesticide is mosquito specific, except for BT when it's put into water. Anything else that they're spraying all over your yard is going to kill everything it touches.
Looks like somebody has a question about the Tree of Heaven and what herbicide can you use for that?
So you can use a variety of different herbicides, but in terms of something that's available to the homeowner, there's something called brush killer. It comes with like a little paintbrush or stump killer. and you just paint it on. It's usually something called triclopyr, which is specific to broadleaf things, aka trees, shrubs, broadleaf perennials. So it wouldn't kill, for instance, a grass or something like that. But you could also use some other things, but that's the one that's most easily available to homeowners.
Yeah, one of the I actually and I don't know if it was specific to the location where I was doing it. There was a property that we managed for Valley Forge Audubon, and we had tree of heaven growing inside of the woods. And what I had done was at about 5 foot, I actually girdled the tree completely. And then what it did, fortunately, in my case, is it tried to regrow from the top heights, and I would just snap off the branches. And eventually what happened was it basically didn't have any additional energy after
Good.
and I didn't have to use any pesticide whatsoever, but I had to, just girdle completely around the tree, and I took off about 5 to 6 inches completely into the main bark. And again, I did it at 5 foot. And what it did was it forced the tree tried to regrow, not from the stump, but from the top half. And then just as it grew, just snap them off, snap them off, snap them off. And eventually it really worked. Eventually something, and I don't know if my particular case, if it was a shaded environment, it wasn't really shaded, it was part shade. So I don't know if that helped the cause as compared to full sun, but it did seem to work.
I'm glad that worked for you. So the one downside for that is if this tree is near a house or it's very large or something like that, and you kill the whole thing and you leave a snag, the possibility of it falling. So, but if you have the opportunity and you don't mind it falling in whichever direction, that's a great thing to try.
Let's see. Well, that looks like the end of our questions. Sam, I thank you so much. This is a wonderful presentation. We really appreciate all the wonderful information. And as I said, we'll love to have you back in the future.
I look forward to chatting about insects some more. Thank you all so much for listening. I really appreciate it. And I hope you all have a wonderful evening.
Thank you. You also.